Hello, everyone. Thank you for being so flexible. Apologies again for those who were expecting to come to a on-site event. Yeah, circumstances happened today that were very unexpected. So thank you for all joining me here. As Nicola said, I'm presenting on my thesis research. Basically, I looked at the concept of online church and what it might mean for the Anglican Church going forward into the future. And my suspicion at the time was very much that that we were kind of going through a bit of a crisis during COVID, and so we were kind of acting very quickly. But eventually we would need to be able to inspect this in a bit more depth. And when that happened, I wanted to include people who were not the kind of usual authorities in church. So not just the priests and the theologians, although I interact with them as well, but also some of the people who turn up and experience church and as congregation members. Because I think it's important to listen to the whole church on this particular topic. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Hilary Willett. I'm a priest in the Anglican Church based in the Diocese of Auckland. And before that, I was studying theology, and before that, I was studying some more theology. And I actually know Nicola from when I first started studying theology, and she really helped me develop in my thinking about God and life. So this really feels like student presenting to teacher for me at the moment. So thank you, Nicola, for inviting me to talk for NZCIS. I've been a fan of this group since its inception, really. It's amazing the quality of speakers and information made available to us all by NZCIS. It's a real gift, so big fan. So I'm here to talk about a thesis I did from 2021 to 2023 through Otago University. Dr. Lynn Taylor was my supervisor, who is here tonight as well. So hi, Lynn. And honestly, it's because of Lynn that anything tangible emerged through all of the stress of getting a thesis across the line. She was incredibly supportive. So thank you, Lynn, and thank you for being here today. This case study was called The Community of St. Julian and was done during COVID-19 lockdown. So it was one of the bigger ones that happened in Auckland while the rest of the country was kind of roaming free. Auckland had to go into another lockdown, and during that lockdown, I initiated this case study and basically asked the question of whether online church might be a viable form of ministry in the future. And what I discovered was that it is not only viable, but incredibly needed for some members of the church. So just to give you an overview of where we're going in this talk, I thought I would introduce myself a little bit more. I'm a big fan of introductions, and it personally informs a lot of my research. So knowing a little bit about me helps you to understand why I care about the things that I do. And then I'll come to my research topic, what we did in the community of St. Julian, the results of that case study, and why I believe this matters. So first, a little bit about myself. So I'm originally from Christchurch. I have two younger siblings, and the rather glam lady in the raincoat is my mum, who is also here. So hi, Mum. Sorry, I probably should have told you about this before just putting this photo up, but that's my mum. You might say that my flair for the dramatic has been going on a while by this photograph. I grew up charismatic Baptist, but I've been to a number of different churches over the years, including Presbyterian, Apostolic, non-denominational, charismatic, and many others. But I've really found a home in Anglicanism. So last year I was ordained a priest, and this is the first service I led or presided over in Anglican terminology. This was a Eucharist service, and I was about to bless the bread and the wine in this photograph. So Anglicanism is the tradition that I am grounded in. I have found a lot of life in this space. And after growing up in very Protestant spaces that are sometimes very cerebral, it was quite a thing to encounter faith expressed through symbols and liturgy. Personally, I'm a very visual person, and I believe in seeing theology in the real world. And Anglican theology is generally a very sacramental theology. There is a significant diversity of expression in the Anglican Church. There are charismatic Anglicans and Reformed Anglicans and Anglo-Catholic Anglicans. It is very hard to sum up. Just a note for if you ever want to write a thesis on Anglicanism, it is hard to sum up. But one thing that is reasonably clear, at least in Aotearoa, is that many of us have a sacramental view of the world and believe in sacraments in some form or another. There are strictly two sacraments within Anglicanism, baptism and the Eucharist, and these are considered outward signs of inward grace. But the concept of sacramentality goes a little further for some Anglicans. For example, the New Zealand Prayer Book, which Anglicans use to inform their worship. We mention sacramental actions, which includes confirmation, reconciliation, ordination, and so on. And so in many ways, the two definite sacraments within the Anglican Church, baptism and the Eucharist, operate within a wider sacramental theology, which emphasizes incarnational, symbolic, and embodied ways of being the church. So, for example, in this photo that you have up on your screen, pretty much everything about it has symbolic meaning. So the white robe that I'm wearing, or the alb, the rope around my waist, although you can't see it in this photo, the scarf or the stole, the table, the linen, the candles, the chalice, everything has meaning. And this is the space that I inhabit, and it informs my research and is very important to me personally. And the reason that I bring some of this up is because ultimately my talk is on online church. And for many, this way of doing church has struck people as a quite disembodied form of doing church. That online church is anathema to embodied or sacramental worship. And I disagree with this. I think that the risk is to possibly assume that my disagreement means that I don't care about embodied worship. But actually, this isn't the case. I do believe the church operates well when it's being embodied. And I just happen to also think that online church is embodied. But more on that later. So this was my thesis question. It's basically just asking, is there space in the Anglican Church of New Zealand and Aotearoa for online church from a tikanga Pākehā perspective? Now, some of that, again, is using very Anglican terminology. In the Anglican Church, there are three different streams of Anglican identity. There's tikanga Pākehā, tikanga Māori, and tikanga Pacifica. And those three strands, we operate together, but we're also distinct. So we kind of form a lot of our ways of doing liturgy within our own tikanga. And I'm very much answering this question from a tikanga Pākehā perspective. I'm conscious that I possibly could have answered this question without doing practical research. But as I say, I do believe in embodied research and embodied practice. So it felt right to do something embodied. And I should say that my thesis was kind of ended up being made up of two different parts. The first was the actual thesis, which answered this question. And the second was the appendices, which may not seem super important, but actually was where I ended up putting a lot of the detail of what we actually did in community of St. Julian. So I ran out of words in my 40,000 word thesis, and so I put about 18,000 of them in my appendices. And that's basically just going into some of the detail of what we did week by week. And personally, I think makes for a good presentation. So I'm actually going to be talking a bit about the appendices, talking a bit about what we actually did. But I will be referring to some of the other research that came up in the thesis proper. So why do this research? As I mentioned, my research was conducted during the COVID-19 pandemic, during a lockdown, and the topic of online church was being wrestled with by many priests throughout the world, particularly sacramental ones. For them, the question of whether meeting online is a valid form of gathering is a really significant question. But many Anglicans had significant concerns about online gathering in any sacramentally significant sense. So we could gather and read about the Bible and possibly listen to some music together on Zoom often. But in New Zealand, we were not allowed to have a Eucharist service. And I just want to be clear, I actually don't disagree with that decision. That was a decision that was made by the bishops of Aotearoa. And given all the panic that was happening during COVID-19, I actually kind of think it was a wise decision because we were just scrambling, trying to make do. But again, I think this is hopefully a time for further reflection. So some perspectives came out from priests around the world. So this is the Reverend Dr. Brian Douglas, who is a priest in Canberra, an Anglican priest, and he wrote a really great article, actually. The Virtual Eucharists in the Time of COVID-19 was a really good article on this issue, and kind of outlined some of the concerns that basically bread and wine in one place is not equivalent to bread and wine in another place. Priestly consecration is not operative in any real way in the homes of people accessing a service via electronic means. And he kind of highlights one of the big things, which is that if we were to start doing something like this, this would be a radical departure from, or a radical shift from our current way of understanding the world as Anglicans. We also had Bishop Michael Curry from America. So he's the presiding bishop in the Episcopal Church, and he kind of highlights that sacraments are communal actions. So this is actually something that's worth highlighting. Anglicans believe that you cannot have a Eucharist alone. So you cannot have a priest kind of bless the elements and so the bread and the wine alone and have people watching. That's not something that Anglicans really can do. Anglicans do have to have other people in the room or in the gathering in order for the Eucharist to be considered valid. So it's worth just highlighting that this is why the communal actions thing is being highlighted here. This is actually not an Anglican perspective, it's a Catholic one, but it comes from New Zealand, and I try to highlight New Zealand perspectives wherever I can. But it does have a similar kind of concern around the lack of essentialness of kind of online gathering. And while I disagree with this perspective, I think it is a really good outline of what the current thinking is for a lot of Anglicans. Yeah, so something you may have noticed from all of these quotes so far is that they're all priests. And And I think I just want to highlight that, again, that part of my motivation in doing this research was to highlight the perspectives of other people, so people who weren't necessarily priests. So my overall thesis basically looked at a bunch of different issues, including the Aotearoa Anglican perspective on embodiment, and I went through the prayer book and a lot of, so that makes up a lot of the background of my research. And then I gathered some volunteers to participate in practical theological action research, for the technical term. So what this means is I gathered a group of 9 Anglican volunteers together. We did online church for 10 weeks. And I should mention that one participant was not able to finish the 10-week project because of unexpected circumstances due to COVID. So it ended up being 8 individuals. This research, as I said, was conducted during a lockdown. So actually finding volunteers was remarkably easy because everyone was very interested in this topic. All the participants were given 2 anonymous surveys. So the first was before participation, the second was after. And it was basically, apart from asking for demographic information, it was also asking for prior experiences of the participants with online technologies and their beliefs about on-site and online church and sacramentality, and some theological concepts thrown in there as well. So then the participants and myself met together as a community for 10 weeks. And we filled out, at the end of that, we filled out a second survey where I asked basically whether some of the perspectives had changed for the participants around online church and sacramentality. I analysed those surveys and drew some conclusions, and I put those in conversation with Anglican theologies and digital theologies. And there's a lot of detail about that in my thesis. I won't cover all of that, but if you do want to read more, that's available. But as I mentioned, what the community of St. Julian actually looked like for those 10 weeks and what we did together, there wasn't actually enough room for that in my thesis proper. So basically, I'm wanting to cover some of that now. And as I say, I'm a highly visual person, so I'm just going to show you some stuff. So this is the home page of the community of St. Julian. Now, just as a small disclaimer, all of these screenshots, they were taken before participation in the community itself, so it does not undermine the anonymity of any of the participants. So I've been quite careful in choosing photos there. And this does mean that I'm a little bit limited around what I can show you of the actual community, but I can show you a bit of the space we inhabited. So the online building, as I like to think of it. So a key feature of this online building was a website. And after completing the first online survey, all the participants were given a login to a private website. This was an intentional decision to make it very private, partly, to protect anonymity, but also bearing in mind some of the concerns that Anglicans have had about online worship, that we might end up having people transferring from on-site to online and, lose on-site altogether. This was kind of a way of testing out a buy-in of sorts, so that it's actually not just super easy to turn up however you want. You actually do have to sign up to a certain extent and get a password. I attempted to build this site bearing in mind sacramentalism and symbolism. So I read articles on semiotics and meaning creation to aid this. So I attempted in particular to make this website multimodal, which is basically meaning that it engages with different senses. So it's not just visual, there's also other things going on. So there's some sound and a few other things. And this is actually really similar to on-site experience. We actually have, technologically, we have a very multimodal experience. We have books, we have music, we have stained glass windows. It's actually not completely technology. We're never technology free. So it's an interesting comparison. The different landing pages reflect different rooms of a physical church, and the colors have meaning. So the warm kind of yellow was about being inviting, and soft colors so that people would feel kind of peaceful when they arrived at this website. I wanted to make it contemplative with a landscape, nature to invoke a sense of beauty. The Anglican font for the heading, which I'll just zoom in on. So this font was modelled after the font originally used in early editions of the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, which incidentally I've been using throughout this PowerPoint. And finally, I wanted this website to be inclusive. So what this means is I tried to do a number of different things. So the first was to make the space really easy to navigate. So hopefully a really easy layout. We've got all of the home, the chapel, all that sort of stuff up the top, but then you can also scroll down and you've got more than one way to get to where you need to go. There are images that are tied in with the various rooms of the website. And this is just to make sure that it's really difficult for people to get lost, which is an important feature. It's also worth noting that this website, while it looks like it might be white on black, I actually did light grey on dark grey to reduce sensory overwhelm. This is again about accessibility because there is some research to suggest that some people find black and white, the harshness of the contrast, quite distracting and overwhelming. So that was another feature. Just a final note, the homepage, like all good church foyers, became the place where I posted notices and updates. So if participants found something that they didn't like, they could contact me and I would make adjustments. I tried to do this reasonably transparently to show that I was wanting feedback and we were creating a community together. Here are some of the other rooms. So this is the prayer wall. This is an embedded Padlet system, which allowed people to post on the website. Participants could at any time during the 10 weeks post prayers that they had for themselves or communities. The different sections mirror sections that Anglican prayers are divided up into in a traditional service during intercessions. So prayers for the world, prayers for the community, prayers for ourselves. We had the tea room. In this space, there were a number of different forums where participants could post if they wished. This was a check-in forum, a God Chats forum, and a creative projects forum. This, by the way, was by far the most popular forum. The participants really got into sharing their projects online and connected quite a bit with each other in this way. So you could like or react to what was being posted, and everyone really got into it, which was actually really lovely. The group I had was very supportive, so I didn't need to moderate the content in this space, but I suspect if this were done again, there would need to be quite active moderation for these sorts of things. This is the library. So this was honestly very minimal. It just kind of included some resources that the participants might find interesting or useful for their 10 weeks. But I suspect if something like this were to continue in the future, it would need to continue to be populated with other resources. This is the bell tower. This was probably one of my favorite pages. This was a page devoted to podcasts. So an audio player was embedded into the website, which allowed participants to listen to the Bible being read to them in a Lectio Divina style. Music was incorporated at the end so that the participants had time to reflect on the reading that they'd just heard. And finally, this is the chapel. So the chapel, the intention of this page was that Zoom would be embedded into the page so that participants would be able to just kind of go into the chapel, click on Zoom, and then they'd be into our weekly gathering. So we had a weekly gathering at 7 o'clock on a Sunday night. Unfortunately, Zoom is quite grumpy about people embedding their platform into another one. And the only way to do this is through money. And I was on a tight budget. So in the end, we just sent out a Zoom link. It was a shame this couldn't work, but I think the idea of it still holds some weight. I think it could be done. You just need a bit of funding. Moving on. So over the 10 weeks, we did a number of different things. And I thought I would just run through those very quickly. So the first week was introductions. The second week, we looked at singing. Now, just to kind of highlight, this was an experimental time. So basically, my goal was to work out the most effective way to do various parts of an Anglican service. So the kind of key bits. So there's sermons, there's singing, we did a bunch of different things. So for example, with singing, what we did was we experimented with a number of different ways of worshiping together. So the first option was a live performance of singing. So basically I embedded a video into, or I shared a video in Zoom of a live performance of singing, which we all listened to as part of the service. The second option was a studio enhanced video. So a video essentially meant to be experienced as a video. The third was attempting to sing all together on Zoom. And for any of you who have done that, I imagine you know how that went. That was probably the funniest experiment I did. I struggled not to laugh throughout the whole thing because everyone sings at a different time. But, you know, had to be done, had to get the research, so we did it. And the final option was singing with a leader. So this was where everyone else had their microphone switched off and mine was on. And basically I would sing, in this case, Teze, and people would sing along with me. And this, by the way, was by far the most successful option. So we experimented with a number of other things. We tried eating together. We tried different forms of sermon delivery. So by recording or live. We tried different forms of engagement. So we used the Zoom chat, the Zoom breakout rooms and whiteboard. And I actually found that this was a very successful way of engaging on Zoom after a sermon, was to have these kind of breakout spaces. We did sacramental roles. So this was where we tried to incorporate some Anglican roles into the service. So we had a liturgist, we had crucifers, we had thurifiers, you know, acolytes, all of these sorts of things. And basically what that looked like was an acolyte who in a traditional service holds a candle. They just brought a candle and put it in view of their camera so that everyone could see that candle. We also tried an immersive view for this particular session, which was actually quite fun, to be honest. It was a little weird, I have to say. I don't know how I personally found it, but some people really enjoyed it. And it was basically, it's a particular function of Zoom where when you turn it on, everyone's little cameras, they get positioned into a photograph. So obviously these aren't the people who were in my cohort, but that was the actual photo we used. So this is just to kind of give you an idea of what that looked like. We also looked at apps. So I got everyone to download Kahoot, and we did a Kahoot quiz. So that's a kind of quiz app. We went into the metaverse together very briefly, a very brief kind of touch into this space. So this is where we entered into a place called Topia, where it's a metaverse world where I set up stations and people could interact with these stations. So this gives you an idea of what this looked like. So you had a little avatar, and you could wander around various parts of this world and interact with little things. So for example, if you walked particularly close to the pictures on the wall, you would be able to see artworks and do some Visio, some reflection on images. I forget the actual term now. This is an example of that. So that's me standing close to a projector screen and a little video pops up. So that was kind of how this world worked. You could also stand next to other avatars and have a conversation with people. So it was actually quite a fun little world. And I just want to say, we had quite a diverse range of age groups and everyone did very well. Like this was definitely not one of those situations where only the young people in the room were able to do it. Everyone engaged and really got into it actually, which was a delight. Then in week 9, we tried to put a lot of the stuff we had learned together. So this was basically putting the sacramental roles in alongside what we had found the best form of singing to be, alongside what we had found the best form of delivering a sermon to be, putting it all together into one service to see how that went. My personal experience of that was that it was incredibly rewarding to see it all come together. It was a lot of work. And to be honest, I think this could easily be a full-time job if this was something that was continued. I don't think this could be something on the side. It was a lot of work getting everything in place. And then in the final week, we farewelled each other and then I kind of said, a survey is going to be coming. So the results. So 6 out of 8 participants said they had enjoyed it more than they had expected. And 2 out of 8 said that it was about the same as what they had expected. So everyone seemed to have a reasonably positive experience of this community. For all the results, you'll need to read my thesis because there were a lot. So I've just pulled out some of the kind of key ones. In the entrance survey, 6 out of 8 participants said they had found online attendance easier than on-site attendance, and 2 out of 8 said they found it about the same as attending on-site. I do need to highlight one particular response in this case. So this was the response of someone that I called F. So F self-identified as ADHD, and basically their response was quite dramatically different to a lot of the other responses, quite often actually, but in this one it was particularly important because this kind of ties into the neurodivergence that Nicola was mentioning, which is that basically F said that this was a lot easier. And the reasons that they gave were different to the reasons of other participants. So the other participants said it was largely about not having to navigate traffic and all that sort of thing. F, on the other hand, was talking about in depth about all the emotional and physical preparation that's required to go to an on-site church. So this is cognitive and emotional and a physical drain. That going into public transport for half an hour is really emotionally exhausting. That navigating an anxiety-inducing social situation where they don't necessarily feel like they belong or are wanted is also a massive emotional and physical drain. Dealing with emotional conflict, if there's a theologically distressing topic that comes up, that this is a huge emotional drain. Managing physical restlessness. So as I mentioned, they identified as ADHD. And so having to sit and listen for an extended amount of time was particularly challenging. There were some cognitive and executive functioning drains in doing this. And then at the end of all of that, they then have to go back into traffic and have all the physical and sensory overload of getting back home. And they said that this process wiped them out for the rest of the day. So it's incredibly significant. I think that it wasn't just, this is difficult. It's that the rest of the day was gone for them. So that was a really interesting and very insightful response, I thought. And they also just highlighted that this was one of the first times that they had felt like it was easy to attend, was in an online space. So this is something that I'll come back to. Another result in the entrance survey, 4 participants felt that on-site worship was inherently better. However, in the exit survey, all 4 of those people changed their language to having a preference for on-site worship. I thought that this was really interesting, that as a result of being involved in this community, they shifted their language quite significantly. And the final result that I'll just talk about is that all the communities, that all participants felt that communities like this one should continue. And this was even despite the fact that some of them felt that it wasn't for everyone. So one person wrote that this probably wasn't for them, this kind of community, even though they had enjoyed it and they wanted them to continue. This isn't something that would be accessible for everyone. And I wanted to bring that up because again, there has been this concern in Anglican spaces that if we go online, everyone will go online and no one will attend on-site church anymore. And I actually just don't think that's going to be the case. I think that there are a lot of people who prefer on-site interaction and always will, and that's kind of fine. So I think this person, after going through this case study, recognized that for them it was really important to be on site, and I do think that this is important. The other note I wanted to bring up, this was a quote from F again, and it was basically in response to the question, will having online services undermine the sacramentality of the Eucharist? So if we were to have a sacramentally significant service, would this undermine sacramentality? And I think that this is just a great response, because basically it's asking the question of, but how far is too far? If we are already using screens and we're already using technologies to enhance sound, and we're using all of these technologies already to mediate services, at what point does it become kind of disembodied? At what point do we stop doing something that is sacramentally significant? And I think I also want to highlight that this really reflective response highlights the need for us to listen to the whole church, because wisdom doesn't just reside with traditional authorities in this subject, but actually the whole church. The whole church is capable of thinking about this and comes up with really fascinating reflections. So I'll run through this quite quickly because I'm conscious of time. But basically, I just want to go into what some of the wider church says on this subject. I'm conscious that a lot of the research I did at this point was interacting with published people, which does mean that they have some kind of recognized authority potentially. So I'm just conscious of that. And I also want to highlight that this conversation has been going on for a long time. So I'm a real newbie in this space, but this has been going on since before the 80s. It really started taking off in the 80s. Some of the theological thinking about digital religion really started to happen then. And I also want to acknowledge the work of Dr. Stephen Garner, who is here, and the work of Dr. Heidi Campbell, who were both incredibly informative for me about my thinking around this space. Dr. Stephen Garner was very supportive throughout, which was really nice. And I recently met Dr. Heidi Campbell, which was very exciting for me. There are many other scholars I've referenced, but yeah, I haven't met them all. And I have been writing in this area for decades. The second thing that I need to acknowledge is there's a significant diversity of Anglican thought on this subject. Some are very open to the concept of online church, some have some reservations, and there is not just one stance on this. So the first really important point is that digital religion does challenge traditional institutions. So I don't think there's really a way of getting around this. Online technologies have a democratizing effect. They can lessen the influence of traditional sources of power. And a quote that kind of highlights this just comes from Christopher Helland, who talks about how religious authorities often determine how we interact with the sacred, but in online spaces, there's a lot more agency to kind of choose how we interact. So it's worth acknowledging that some of this stuff actually does tap on some quite tricky subjects, I think, for church. Technology has become a source of identity for a lot of people. So in 2021, during the COVID pandemic, the Methodist Church released a report on online worship. They are also a highly sacramental and liturgical church. So they actually bear a lot of resemblance to Anglican spaces. And they highlight that the digital world is quickly becoming a place where people understand themselves. So this means that we're not just digitally literate, we're living digital lives. And that actually it's increasingly difficult to separate out online and on site. They also highlight that human beings, not technology, are at the root of many of the issues that we have with technology. So technology is a medium that often carries a lot of our own baggage and our own ideological viewpoints. Technology is not free of bias. So obviously it does not occur in a vacuum. And I think we can see that with places like X, for example, where they really do hold particular values in the medium. And we need to be aware of that. So this is where I start tackling the issue about embodiment. I mentioned before that some Anglicans believe that online spaces are very unembodied or disembodied. But there are lots of people who have written about this. And basically they're kind of saying we remain embodied I'm sitting in a room. I'm kind of joining you via media, but I am sitting in a room interacting with a physical object. These things are not actually completely disembodied. It's not a magic space that we're operating in. It is actually a very physical one. And so the idea that we become disembodied by engaging with technology, I mean, again, it's a question of how far do we go? Because we also use technology in on-site services. So a good quote, a good writer on this is Catherine Schmidt. And she just talks about how we do actually use our bodies when we are engaging with online technologies. Some other views about about embodiment. So this was a particularly interesting one for me, and that was the argument that disembodiment first occurred with the printing press, and because in the past, preaching of the word was the primary source of theological information in a church service. But when we had the printing press, suddenly we had mass production and dissemination of ideas, which allows for a more disembodied transmission, interior reflection of the text. Rather than doing this kind of in community, we're able to do that by ourselves. So there's actually some perspectives that say that online technologies represent a shift back to a more oral culture or a more embodied one. So virtual reality is not a recent development. So this actually came from an Anglican, which I was very pleased to see. So Andrew McGowan wrote on this. He was kind of very ho-hum about it, but he did acknowledge that the development of the book allowed for the BCP with a kind of intention of virtual unity among English Christians, independent of physical location and time. So this isn't the first example of virtual reality. We've had examples of this for a while. And this shift back into a more embodied space is sometimes called a second orality, where basically we are, by interacting with technology, we're not actually just writing anymore like we did with the printing press. We're writing as a form of talking. Like it's quite a different experience. And this becomes even more complicated when we factor in videos like TikToks and Reels and all that sort of thing. Suddenly we've got real people engaging in some way. And there is a medium involved in that, but it's an interesting shift from the printing press. However, we risk losing wisdom. And I think that this is actually a really beautiful point that was made, again, a long time ago, which is that with the mass production of information, it's hard to discern truth. And this is where we start to need traditions to guide us, like the church. So this is just a quote talking about how lots and lots of information drives out knowledge, let alone wisdom. So this is where I actually think the church could play a very vital role in kind of highlighting what we have known about wisdom and being wise online, for example. So why does this matter? So I've obviously mentioned wisdom and the possibility of information driving out wisdom, but there are several others that I think matter for the church, that it matters that we are involved. And the first is because issues of technology are really real. There are a lot of issues, and I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of them. And personally, I think the church can play a really positive role in highlighting the need for people to be considered, so that it's not just a kind of mass stage of these massive international players kind of determining how we think about things, but actually we've got other institutions going, no, we need to value people, we need to value community. So I think the church can have a really positive impact here. There are communities that benefit from online worship, in my opinion. So in my case study, that was F. So they highlighted that there were ongoing challenges to regular on-site attendance, and this isn't uncommon. There are many other examples of neurodivergent people who struggle with on-site attendance, which you can read about in my thesis. But just to give you an example, so this came from Louise Gosbell, and her daughter experiences quite extreme has extreme needs. So for her daughter Maisie, on-site is largely inaccessible. It's unsafe for Maisie to engage with children's programs. She has to be highly aware of her body temperature, which she's unable to regulate if it moves into extremes. If temperatures move into extremes for her, she can experience nosebleeds and seizures. She has learning disabilities, which means that she often struggled to follow what happened in a sermon and wanted to ask questions throughout. I suspect that this person also potentially had some neurodivergence and struggled with unfamiliar situations, experiencing anxiety when changes to the service were made or when unknown people approached her. So there is a group of people who would really benefit from this kind of church. And finally, because we're called to be salt and light in all places, not just on-site ones, but in all places. And that is why I think this stuff matters.